both a legislative majority that supports a government and an independently elected president. Now, a semi-presidential system is not as common. And one case we'll look at is the case of France. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about the distribution of power in this type of a system. So in a semi-presidential system, executive power is shared between a president who is directly elected and a prime minister who is appointed by the president or directly elected. And so right off the bat, there's a sort of co-equal role for these different executives or these different heads of government, so to speak. There's the prime minister and the president, except their election is different. The president is directly elected, as in presidentialism, and the prime minister is appointed by the president or directly elected, as in a parliamentary system. So really the president is a powerful figure who enjoys direct election and enjoys power over the prime minister to some extent, although it's more nuanced because of the different functions of the legislative and executive powers. But the president is directly elected, appoints the prime minister, can dissolve the parliament, and has general responsibility for things like foreign affairs, defense, the military, and has emergency powers. And so the president is a powerful figure. The prime minister is responsible either to the president or to parliament or to both, assembles the cabinet, usually from the ruling party or the coalition in the assembly. And the cabinet and the prime minister jointly have special responsibility for domestic and day-to-day affairs. And what that means then is legislative functions and the duty to legislate and to create law and policy in response to the problems faced by the country, more or less. Whereas the president functions as the executive institution involved in foreign affairs, defense, etc. The prime minister and the cabinet are, of course, involved in legislative duties. Now, this is not common, as I said. Very few democracies have a semi-presidential system, around 20 total, but the number has recently increased because it was adopted in many new democracies in Eastern Europe. And one example that is very often cited is the example of France. And France is an interesting case because it's a case of a powerful executive, a powerful president, but one who nevertheless shares power with a prime minister who is, for all intents and purposes, in charge of those legislative duties with that support of the majority in the parliament. Now, in France and in many other cases, the president appoints the prime minister. The prime minister is responsible to the French parliament. Now, does the president truly just decide whoever is going to be the prime minister? Not necessarily. It obviously is going to be influenced by the legislative election results, the parliamentary results in the votes obtained by different parties. And so the possible candidates really is shaped by the election results in the same way that it would be in a parliamentary system. It's just that the president, not the parliament, is the one who appoints the prime minister. So really, the duty is just kind of shifted to the president. This is one way in which the president has important powers in a semi-presidential system. Now, it's not always the case, though, that the president and the prime minister are from the same party. In fact, because of what I just told you, that the president's choices are limited by the election results for the parliament, sometimes the president and the prime minister are from different parties, meaning the president appointed a prime minister from a different party based upon election results that were less favorable to the party of the president and more favorable to a different party. This is an arrangement that we call cohabitation, where the president and the prime minister are from different parties. It's a power sharing arrangement. We call it that because they are sharing power, not just between those offices of president and prime minister, but between the party of the president and the party of the prime minister. And so cohabitation is interesting because it presents challenges to the model in the sense that it creates some tense situations, often because the parties are opposition parties. And so France is an interesting case, especially before 2002, when cohabitation was more common, because the term of the president was 7 years, and the term of the assembly was 5 years. And so what that meant then was there were more possibilities for cohabitation during that 2-year period. It happens less frequently these days, though, because there have been constitutional changes that have changed the terms for the different branches. But France is an interesting case, and it goes to show you that a semi-presidential system can truly contain features of both types of systems. And this brings us to this slide, where we can begin to classify parliamentary, presidential, and semi-presidential democracies in terms of really two sets of questions. First, is the government responsible to the elected legislature? If the answer is no, it's a presidential democracy. Remember that the president is independently elected and has independent survival. The existence of that government in a presidential democracy does not depend on the legislative majority to exist. But if the answer is yes, well, then we ask another question, which is the head of state popularly elected for a fixed term in office? If the answer is no, it's a parliamentary system. Because in a parliamentary system, the government answers to the majority in the legislature and depends on that majority to exist. But the head of state is not popularly elected for that fixed term. That prime minister depends on that legislative majority. As the head of state and the head of government, they have both functions, but they are not independently elected. That's a parliamentary system. A semi-presidential system is one where the head of state and the head of government are separate. And the head of state, being separate from the prime minister, is directly elected for a fixed term in office, the example of France. And so this is how the distribution of power between these different systems works. And that distribution of power primarily relates to the balance of power and the roles in the election of the executive and the legislative branches. Now, we already talked about how parliamentary systems are the most common. And this is what we see here. This is data from the early post-war period through about 2008. And it shows you that parliamentary systems by far outnumber both presidential systems and semi-presidential systems. Parliamentary systems are especially common in Europe, but also common in former British colonies, and to a lesser extent, but still a great extent in former French colonies as well. In Latin America, where there's a Portuguese and a Spanish colonial legacy, presidentialism is more common. But the point is that parliamentarism is the most common form of democratic government in the world. Presidential systems of the like in Latin America, in the United States, in some other places is less common. There really are only 28 of them in the world. And so in some ways, the system we live under is unique and exceptional because it's less frequent. Semi-presidential systems are even less common. Now, the percentage of democracies by regime type also shows you that the largest percentage is parliamentary, the second largest is presidential, and then the third largest, or the last in line, is semi-presidential. And so this gives you a sense then of how power is distributed between these branches in these different systems, and then the frequency and how common these different systems are. Now, this discussion about the distribution of power and about the ways that these systems function brings us to maybe the most important debate of all when it comes to different forms of democratic government. And that is the debate about the merits of presidentialism versus the merits of parliamentarism. And really, this is a debate about what's been referred to as the perils of presidentialism and the potential disadvantages of presidential government for democracy and for political stability. And really, the debate revolves around the view that some hold that presidentialism undermines democracy. And according to this view, presidentialism has a number of flaws or features that make it prone to crises. These include dual democratic legitimacy between multiple independently elected branches, rigidity that comes from fixed terms in re-election dates or election dates, winner-take-all rules that hand entire constituencies to the winner of the plurality of the vote, as opposed to proportional representation rules that hand out seats or constituencies according to the percentage of the vote obtained by different parties. The absence of re-election in many systems, the rise of outsiders that becomes possible through independent election and independent survival, and then the possibility of regime breakdown. Now, parliamentarism is seen as the antidote to these different challenges because parliamentarism is viewed as more flexible and because it's viewed as sensitive to the kinds of dysfunctions that take place in politics and that demand often a kind of redress of the system in the form of a change in government or other kinds of reforms. And so this is a debate that we're going to evaluate the different claims of. And we're going to take a look at some of the evidence. And we're going to focus primarily on the Latin American experience. And the reason is because Latin America has the single largest proportion of presidential democracies in the world. 15 of the 28 in the world are in Latin America. And so it's not an unrepresentative sample. In fact, in some ways, it's the best possible sample. So we'll look at the Latin American experience, but we're also going to draw out some questions that implicate or ask about the United States experience, because the United States is, after all, a presidential democracy. And it's one that may be sort of vulnerable to some of these flaws or some of these sources of dysfunction. And we'll evaluate that possibility and discuss the possibility when we get there here momentarily. But I want you to remain engaged and be ready to discuss this, because there's a real opportunity here for us to take on questions of real importance for politics, for our daily lives, for the next election, and so on and so forth. So let's get started. So the first peril of presidentialism is what's called the issue of dual democratic legitimacy. And Juan Lenz, who identified these perils, puts it this way in the piece that I had you read for Thursday of last week. Who, on the basis of democratic principles, is better legitimated to speak in the name of the people, the president or the congressional majority that opposes his policies? Since both derive their power from the vote of the people, a conflict is always latent and sometimes likely to erupt dramatically. There is no democratic principle to resolve it. Before we continue, I want to draw out an important question, and one that is politically important as well as analytically and philosophically and morally and everything else. And that is, who does speak for the people? The president or the congressional majority? And I want to ask you, who do you think speaks for the people in a presidential democracy, the president or the congressional majority?
In United States, I guess it's the president. He speaks for everybody.
Okay, so why doesn't the congressional majority?
Because in this case, the president is usually over the law.
Over
That's
the law.
yes,
Okay, but the law is designed to restrict them too, right?
yes, of course, but the restrictions can be broken. Okay, and I guess this is my opinion, but usually if we have a really democracy, the congressional majority, but not for the opposite party, they can talk for the people.
Yeah, so I think there's something really important about your point, and what you're highlighting is emergency powers. The president has emergency powers. Those are powers that the Congress doesn't have. So that's something that does distinguish the president from the congressional majority in most presidential systems. And so that's a good argument, right? In a literal way, the president enjoys emergency powers. And so from that perspective, legally, constitutionally, there may not be an issue of dual legitimacy if you can argue persuasively that those emergency powers really separate the president from the congressional majority. But there's also another vantage point to ask this question from, which is politically, kind of putting aside the constitutional or the legal aspect. On a political level, who speaks for the people in terms of questions of representation, in terms of voice, responsiveness, the president or the congressional majority? And the reason I'm pressing here is because I want you to see that the source of this dual legitimacy is complex. It is an issue of politics, but also constitutional and legal foundations. It's a question of power, but also political power and political influence and representation in questions that go much deeper often than those legal and technical aspects of the democratic setup that we are so familiar with. So Alexis says there are lots of ways in which the congressional majority and the president can come to be without consideration of the values of their constituents: gerrymandering, redistricting, electoral college, winner-take-all system. I would probably venture to say that neither entities speak for the people, but instead for their political party or to their winning coalition. Of course, if you were to consider mainly the winning coalition that is needed in comparison to the amount of constituents each have, the congressional majority would be more representative of the people's values than the president. Alexis, no disagreement. I think that in practice, these institutions have been badly distorted. And we've talked about how, for example, they can't be argued persuasively to truly represent often the will of the majority, so to speak. But putting that aside and accepting that and putting that aside on a theoretical level, on a kind of more purely almost philosophical level, assuming that the institutions are representative and that they do function to represent the majority in the will of the majority, in the voice of the majority, the question still remains, does the president or does the Congress represent or speak for the people? And Alexis seems to suggest that in terms of representation, the congressional majority may speak more for the people in terms of the extent to which it represents the broad spectrum of views and opinions that might exist in society. That's another argument that might be made. The sort of radius or the extent of representation achieved by that body that may not be achieved in the same way by a president who is, after all, one person. Christiana says the congressional majority. Christiana, is there a reason that you can point to that
I would say congressional majority because Congress, like their main goal is to be reelected, and don't they get like, isn't their reelection more um like, isn't it like every 2 years?
Yeah, so for the House of Representatives, it's shorter terms. The senators are in for longer.
Yeah, so I would say congressional majority would probably speak more for the people, because if they want to get reelected, then like people could see how they vote on specific issues and whether or not they vote towards the majority. And if they see that the member isn't, and like kind of voting based off of their own values and beliefs, then they would be less likely to get reelected. But I would say the president could probably, they would, like when it's closer to their reelection, or like if the president wants to be reelected, like if it's their first term, then probably towards the end of their presidency or end of their term, they would probably take the people more into consideration. But then if it's like their second term, then they may, since they know like whatever, like they can't be president for a third term because the max is 2, then they may take their own values more so, because they're not going to get reelected because it's the end of their presidency.
Yeah, that's a really good answer because in a democracy, we know that elections are an important source of accountability when the system works the way it's supposed to. That contestation that comes from competitive parties, competitive candidates, it really forces the incumbent government maybe to be responsive. In a more important way, maybe shorter terms for the congressional representatives mean that they have to be especially responsive, and maybe they're more accountable to their constituencies, and then collectively they work together more to promote the will of the majority, so to say, because of those imperatives that are more acute for those representatives than, say, the president, who can be reelected once, but who is only reelected after 4 years, and who therefore, though probably responsive in a similar way, doesn't maybe need to be as responsive. That's a very interesting take because Schumpeter, remember, says that elections and contestation really define a democracy. And so the sources of accountability of these elected representatives maybe is really important when we consider, for example, whether the president or the Congress speak for the people. So we've seen some really good arguments. Emergency powers belong to the executive, says Anna Martha, and this is true. Does that not set them apart in terms of their actual capacity to kind of speak for the people in like a legal constitutional sense? On a more political level, there's the accountability in the sort of responsiveness that often come along with the imperatives of reelection for congressional representatives who come up for reelection every 2 years or after a shorter extent or term in office. That's a political argument. That's an interesting argument. As you can see, responsiveness, representation, as mentioned by Alexis, all of these things matter. And the question of who represents the people is one that's not actually very easily resolved. And I'll draw your attention to an ongoing crisis in Venezuela that is experiencing economic crisis as well as humanitarian crisis, but also a political crisis. And in Venezuela, the socialist government has suspended elections, has suspended referendums and recall elections that were designed to serve as a check on the continued hold on power of the administration, the Maduro administration. The administration also weaponized the Supreme Court to seize power from the legislature. But this story all goes back to the beginning of that political crisis, where the legislature, under the control of the opposition, butted heads with the executive under the control of the socialist government, of course. And this gridlock has manifested and sort of stewed for years and years and years to the point where the administration used the Supreme Court to seize power from the legislature in 2017, and to the point where the executive has suspended recall referenda elections that were put in motion and sort of obtained through signatures of the opposition as controlled by the legislature. And so this is a dual power situation, and it shows what Lenz was afraid of, that institutions of government, when independently elected and not necessarily accountable to each other, may become so at odds that they wind up in a gridlock situation, in a situation of dysfunction that threatens the system in its entirety, in the persistence of the situation. So Anna Martha adds that the sense of being the representative of the entire nation may lead the president to be intolerant of the opposition. Yeah, and so Anna Martha is exactly right. This is what's happening in Venezuela. The sense that the independent election of that president means that they are the representative of the people can actually contribute to the gridlock if it means that they are less willing to cooperate or negotiate with a legislature that's controlled by the opposition. And so this is what's happening in Venezuela to a certain extent, and it shows that this conflict is always possible and can be debilitating. But there's more to the story. And what's really important to know is that parliamentary systems are also subject to the problem of dual democratic legitimacy. And in fact, in two different ways. First, there are often two legislative chambers who need to cooperate and who have separate sources of authority, legally and constitutionally speaking. That means there's always the possibility for conflict. There's also an issue of dual legitimacy between parliament and the head of state. And so that head of state has a separate authority than that parliament. And so there can be a dual legitimacy between those two in the same way. And the point that I want to make to you is that all houses of a parliament are legally sanctioned and have their own functions and their own powers. And to a certain extent, they all have their own legitimacy that need not or does not necessarily complement that of the others. And so anytime you have multiple veto players, as we sometimes call them, there's the possibility for breakdown. And so this means then that it might not be fair to single out presidential systems for this problem of dual democratic legitimacy. There's also another peril that relates to the rigidity of presidentialism and specifically the ways that the political process can become broken into what are viewed as very rigidly determined periods, election dates that are firmly set, races that take place during a specific period without the possibility of readjustment in response to political or social or economic events. Remember that these elections in the United States, for example, the presidential election always takes place on the same day, more or less, November 3rd, every 4 years. This is an example of that rigidity that Juan Lenz is talking about, the way that the process becomes so routine that it's inflexible and insensitive to the changes that might come about and that might demand an adjustment of the schedule. Now, according to Lenz, this can be a source of instability. If, for example, that chief executive loses the support of key political groups well before the election. And so, for example, if that president is elected with a majority in the Congress and maybe midterm elections take place and they lose that majority, or maybe that majority simply shifts its loyalties and by the last 2 years of that president's 4-year term, they no longer enjoy the support of the legislative majority, you now have a situation where a weak president has to finish out a term without legislative support. This creates the possibility of gridlock. It almost guarantees gridlock if that president pursues their legislative agenda. And it makes it likely that either side will commit abuses. More often, the executive will commit abuses or behave in a way that contribute to instability or some kind of disorder in the system. But the problem for Linz is that the consequences are not as dramatic as he thought that they would be. And so let's take a look at the Latin American experience and let's see for ourselves how often and what it looks like when these things take place. So first and foremost, impeachment is not uncommon. Impeachment proceedings were used on many occasions. Calor de Mello in Brazil in 1992, against Perez in Venezuela in 93, against Bucaram in Ecuador in 1997, against Lugo in Paraguay in 2012, and against Dilma Rousseff in Brazil in 2016. Of course, we'll add to that impeachment proceedings in the United States against President Donald Trump. Recall elections have also been common. In 2004 in Venezuela, one took place. There was supposed to be another one in Venezuela in, I believe, 2014 or 16. The signatures necessary for the election to go forward were obtained, but the administration canceled the recall referendum. And this marked a very steep descent into authoritarianism in that country because of the obvious violation of a key dimension of contestation in irreversibility. Or uncertainty, excuse me. And then there's also a third process that has been common in Latin America and has been disruptive, but has nevertheless served as a sort of escape valve in those situations where presidents do lose support of key groups well before the new election. And that process is popular outrage leading to the resignation of the president. And so these are usually street protests or uprisings, so to speak. Fujimori in Peru in 2000 was run off from office. De la Rua in Argentina in 2001. Sanchez de Lozada in Bolivia in 2003. These are all examples of presidents who lost the support of key groups before the new election and were essentially sent scurrying home by protesters who were angry and dissatisfied and demanded the ouster of the president. And so when we look at data like this, first of all, no one's saying that Latin America is a profile in stability. Many of these democracies during this period and to some degree still today are somewhat unstable. But these are also new democracies where the rules of the game are still being solidified and are still consolidating. The point that I'd like to make to you is that these events show that presidentialism is not as rigid as Juan Linz thought it would be. To some degree, both ordinary people and political parties in the Congress have more agency than Juan Linz thought they would have. Juan Linz did not anticipate, for example, that people wouldn't just stick with a president they didn't like, that they would actually impeach them, that they would carry out recall elections, or they would even send them scurrying home through popular protest. These are all examples of agency in the ways that people and parties act to get rid of the bums when they don't want to wait for the next election to throw them out. So we're going to watch some videos that put this in perspective for us. These are videos that show impeachment proceedings against Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. Now, Brazil has been renowned for its treatment of presidents, both current and former. And that story has often been a very telling story about some of the instability and some of the conflicts in Brazil. But Brazil is a country we could have a whole class about. And for now, let's focus on the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff of the Workers' Party, who was impeached under corruption allegations. And this is what I'll give you for now, but I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording because Otherwise, if I post this on YouTube, there will be a copyright violation, and they'll block the video. So I'm going to pause this for now while we watch these videos, and then I'll return and I'll continue the recording. And as you can see, the Brazilian case shows that impeachment itself is a way of removing presidents. Now, in the case of Brazil, the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff is highly controversial. As was stated in the video, many of the congressional representatives who impeached her were themselves accused of much worse crimes, including corruption and bribery. But the fact is that in Brazil and elsewhere, impeachment proceedings have been one way of getting rid of presidents before their constitutionally mandated term is up. And we should view this as a sort of corrective to Lins, who anticipated that societies like Brazil would stick it out with those unpopular presidents and wait until the next election. Now, the third peril of presidentialism is what Lins really referred to in conjunction with majoritarian rules or winner-take-all rules. And as he wrote, in a presidential election, whatever the plurality gained, the victorious candidate takes over the whole executive branch, while a leader aspiring to be prime minister whose party gains less than 51% of the seats might be forced to share power with another party. The control of the executive and presidential systems is in principle winner-take-all. And what this means is that that whole constituency goes to that president, despite only winning a plurality or even less than a majority of that vote. And so in that regard, the winner takes all, just as they would take all the chips in a poker game. But this claim is actually suspect. Not only is it not necessarily correct, but in practice, presidential systems work differently than Lins really portrays them as working. And so in the first place, democracies and whether they have winner-take-all rules in the way that those votes are counted really depends on the electoral system and the party system. And so it's the electoral system and whether it's majoritarian or proportional representation that matters. It's the party system and whether it is a two-party system or a multi-party system that will often influence this pattern. It's not as much the case that presidentialism by itself is ruled by this winner-take-all logic. Presidentialism is also predicated on a system of checks and balances between institutions. The legislature and the executive, again, are independently elected, and as a part of this, are sort of in a system of checks and balances that involves each other in one another's accountability. Thirdly, coalitions are not uncommon in these systems. The fact is that it's almost essential to assemble a coalition, especially if there are multiple parties, precisely because independent election means that presidents don't come into power with a ready-made coalition. If they want to pass their agenda, they need to assemble a coalition. And then finally, the truth is that a parliamentary system with disciplined parties and a majority party actually offers fewer checks on executive power than presidentialism does. And it's really important to understand this. Remember that the whole point of a parliamentary system is to produce a government based upon the legislative majority. And the survival of that government depends on the absence of a vote of no confidence and the continued support of that government by that legislative majority. And that means passing its agenda. If a legislative bill is not passed, that threatens the survival of the government. That's a legislative defeat. The whole point is to produce a government that can overcome and avoid that because it enjoys such robust support. And that robust support means in turn that there are very few checks on that prime minister. And so in a parliamentary system, we have examples like Margaret Thatcher, who was, celebrated and renowned sort of liberal, big L liberal prime minister in the 80s in Britain. And Margaret Thatcher was one of these strong prime ministers who enjoyed a disciplined party, a strong legislative majority, and robust support. And she was able to rule in a kind of not an authoritarian way, because she enjoyed democratically won and assembled support, but she ruled in an aggressive way that really showed the capacity of a strong prime minister to rule in a heavy-handed way, in terms of how decisive she was, in terms of the aggressiveness of the reforms that she pursued, and so on. And she was so aggressive and so strong in office that she lost a number of her senior colleagues in her cabinet who objected to that manner of governing. But this is an example that we can use to highlight that the winner-take-all logic papers over both the nuances and the complexity of the presidential system, as well as some of the possible limits from this perspective of the parliamentary system itself that Juan Linz holds up as really the antidote to this problem. The fourth peril is the peril of no re-election. This is Porfirio Diaz up here in the corner. He ruled for almost 30 years in Mexico, and he stayed in power well beyond the end of his constitutionally mandated term. And he was so divisive and had such an impact that in Mexico they fought a revolution and blood was spilled over this event. And after sending him from office, they imposed a one-term limit on all elected offices. And this is the legacy of Porfirio Diaz in Mexico. But the principle of non-re-election in general is a common pattern, not just in Mexico, but other presidential systems in Latin America and elsewhere. Now, this is one peril that may be mostly correct and well established in terms of its negative implications. And so, for example, popular presidents may be forced to step down. No re-election may lead to rushed or ill-designed policies by presidents who fear that they don't have the time in office to pursue their agenda fully. Conflicts might also arise between the current and the former president if that outgoing president views themselves as a lame duck who has little reason or motivation to cooperate with his or her successor. So this principle is designed to prevent the possibility of Porfirio Diaz's being elected and then staying in power for many years beyond the end of their term. But this principle can have negative implications. The issue for Linz, though, is that many presidential systems have actually overcome this by enacting reforms that allow the president to be reelected. Mexico is not one of them. To this day, Mexico still has a one-term limit. And the legacy of Porfirio Diaz in that regard remains intact. But the point that I want to make to you is that these systems are not so inflexible that they cannot be reformed in response to some of the perils that do appear to be well established, and this being one of them. The next peril is what we refer to as the rise of outsiders. And this is the possibility that independent election can give rise to presidential candidates and then presidents who have little experience and who are running primarily with the support of new political parties that have limited relationships or connections to others. And as Juan Linz himself says, the personalized character of a presidential system makes possible, especially in the absence of a strong party system, the access to power of outsiders. And these outsiders are again more likely because they don't need to depend on a legislative majority to exist. Many people say that parliamentary systems guard against this possibility because any head of government is vetted by the political parties who win seats in the legislative election. And in that process, they are able to sort out those outsiders with little experience or few connections or political relationships that they bring to the office. Now, when that dependent election goes away and the president is directly elected, suddenly those outsiders become very, very possible. And not just possible, but in some cases likely. Now, what's the issue with an outsider? Is there anything wrong with that? Isn't this just an example of how inclusive the office can become? no one's against the possibility of newcomers and neophytes coming into politics, but it's kind of like being on a plane and needing a pilot so that you don't crash. You need a pilot, maybe not a doctor. In a similar way, outsiders in politics can be dangerous for democratic governability and institutional performance. So, for example, if it's a president from a weak party and a minority president that does not enjoy a, a majority or a coalition of parties with a majority in the legislature, that often leads to executive legislative conflicts because that weak president will come up against a strong or an oppositional legislature. It's also the case that inexperienced presidents who have limited political socialization in limited capacity to reach out to other parties, this can often also contribute to conflicts, tensions, and antagonisms that can lead to crises. And then maybe most importantly, outsiders are more likely to commit abuses against other institutions, especially the legislature. And so these outsiders can be very, very problematic. And a good example of an outsider is Alberto Fujimori from Peru, quintessential outsider. In the 1980s in Peru, there was a severe economic and political crisis. Fujimori is elected, fills the void by sort of discrediting those existing parties and institutions that had so thoroughly dissatisfied Peruvians. In 1992, 2 years later, he basically dismantles the legislature and calls it a self-coup, an auto-golpe. And this self-coup was designed to concentrate power in his hands. And this was just one example of the many abuses against other institutions like the legislature, the media, the courts, that he committed during his time in office. And Fujimori is held up as sort of the iconic example of an outsider president because of his behavior. And this discussion raises an interesting question. First and foremost, let's point out the obvious. President Donald Trump is an outsider. He came to power with little political experience, no political experience. He does enjoy the support of an established party, but that's not a criterion of the definition. It's not an essential component of the definition. By all intents and purposes, he is an outsider. But this raises an interesting question, which is, as an outsider, does Trump present the kinds of dangers posed by outsider presidents? Is he that dangerous outsider president, or is that fear overblown? This question about the rise of outsiders, it obviously relates to the experience of the United States at this time. And so I want to ask you, does Trump make the US vulnerable to the dangers posed by outsider presidents, or does he not? What do you think? So Anna Martha says, very vulnerable. What do the rest of you all think?
As like an example, he's discrediting anyone who's against him, calling them crazy, giving them weird nicknames. Like, I know when Joe Biden originally got the nomination, he called him Sleepy Joe Biden. And he's trying to stay in power as long as he can. And I feel like that's leaving us vulnerable to the dangers posed by outsider presidents, because he wants to stay in power as long as he can, despite what the election says, if that makes sense.
Certainly. And, I think that the abuses leveled against the media and calling for violence against journalists, more or less, celebrating it, sort of registers as outsider behavior, right? And in a similar way, it's just astonishing to me that he's openly calling for the arrest of his main opponent in the presidential election. That's absolutely remarkable. Like he's furious with Bill Barr, his attorney general, for not doing that. And this is the kind of behavior that we would associate with an outsider, right? Someone who's not committed or doesn't have the same kinds of like ethical commitments, right? That often are an important part of democratic politics. This capacity to work with other parties, to negotiate or cooperate for purposes that don't relate to your immediate self-interest, or at least at a bare minimum, not calling for the arrest of your main opponent and calling for violence against journalists. These are really extraordinary behaviors, and so you can also argue that he's just a provocateur and he's just making incendiary comments. That's one perspective. ISIS says he is known as an outsider as Fujimori, but he is not part of the political circle. People saw him as more of an approachable figure just because of that, although he is a millionaire. So he's probably more of an outsider than Fujimori. Fujimori at least had kind of like an academic career. But I agree, Isis, that he is an outsider. People saw him as outside of the political circle. Without a doubt. But what I want you to think about is, how do presidential systems make it possible for this outcome? And how would the system have produced a different outcome under a different set of rules? If we had a parliamentary system, would we be in this situation? And again, that's accepting that there are differences in viewpoint, in legitimate, valid differences in perspectives regarding this. But the important point for us is that the institutional differences become meaningful when we're looking at the political and the environmental and in the social and the public health consequences of an outsider president who, owes really limited credence to many of the niceties and the conventions of politics. So with all this, Lenz is making a sort of general point that democratic regimes are more likely to survive and consolidate in parliamentary systems. And this is obviously a simplification of the reality, because as we just saw, presidential systems have responded to a number of these internal contradictions. And not only that, but they also often function in ways that Lenz didn't anticipate. Now, it is true, though, that up until the 90s, democracy had been less stable in presidential than in parliamentary systems. But the important point is what follows. It's really a spurious correlation, because most parliamentary systems are located in smaller states that are wealthy and that are often former British colonies. And this meant that they had favorable conditions for democracy. And so it wasn't really a correct inference to attribute presidentialism's flaws to the Latin American experiences up until the 1990s, because those are countries that had been under military rule and that did not have the same colonial legacy as those former British colonies. Now, the evidence that supports this point further is that since the 1990s in Latin America and elsewhere, democracy has been very stable in presidential systems. And so once those countries got time to sort of consolidate and begin to solidify their democratic institutions, presidentialism proved itself to be much more durable than Lenz ever anticipated. But there's even more to this story, and it's the advantages of presidentialism. And these are advantages that Lenz does not discuss and does not address. And so first and foremost, one flip side of the outsider problem is that the direct election of presidents means that that voters have greater choice. Voters themselves decide, at least theoretically, they are the ones who cast the deciding vote. And relatedly, there's the fact that there's more electoral accountability and the identification of electoral options becomes easier as well. And so when you're voting in a parliamentary system, you're voting for parties who will be counted on to faithfully sort of represent what you vote for in their selection of a government. But obviously, you can more directly identify the electoral options because there are fewer steps in between and it's direct election. That means more electoral accountability too. And so, for example, you might have a choice between a number of different types of candidates, from ones on the far right to the far left, and so on and so forth. And then finally, there's the advantage of congressional independence in legislative matters. This is important because remember that I told you that in parliamentary systems, prime ministers have such profound influence often precisely because they enjoy that legislative majority that elected them. The reverse of that is that they can often rule in a semi-authoritarian way and very decisively in the way that Martha, I'm forgetting her name, the Iron Lady in Britain. But when you get away from that and you have independent election, congressional independence means that the Congress itself can become a source of accountability, even while it still functions as a support for a president who can assemble and retain a legislative majority. And so these are benefits that are important in that presidentialism does carry that Lenz did not discuss. And so we are out of time. We've got a couple more slides that I had in mind. Margaret Thatcher, sorry. I was going to say Margaret Stature. Jake adds, it's also scary to think about the long-lasting effects of his outsider politics will have, because I think he's got people believing they can act more carelessly and recklessly than before. Well, certainly if they have, no moral or ethical compunction, Jake, and if they're narcissistic, it helps too. But I think time will tell, and we'll have to see if there are more outsiders like him. But I think even as far as outsiders are concerned, he's way outside. But we're out of time, everybody. I'm going to let you go. I'm going to stop recording. And